Today we're going to continue with our look at the BMAT Section 3 essay, but this time the second part of the conventional rubric, that of the provision of a counter-argument. Now you might be wondering if this section is important or not. It's only going to take up one paragraph at most after all. But if we look at the marking criteria for BMAT, we can see just how important it really is. Failure with this aspect of our essay is going to mean we won't be able to proceed to the higher marks under the quality of content marking criteria. And that's just what we see at scores of 1, where a counterposition is not forwarded at all. This really is a very rare case because a candidate's comprehension of the task, that is if they've completed sections 1 and 2 of the BMAT, normally demands that they be able to read the rubric in section 3. An unconvincing or weak counter gets us a score of 2, and a reasonable one gets us a 3, and it only takes a good counter position to allow us access to the second highest band, with an excellent rendition granting us top marks. Invitations to provide counter positions have a number of different forms in BMAT, from invitations to provide arguments against and ways to state it is not the case that. But by far the most common approach adopted by the BMAT question setters is the simple form of argue to the contrary. Although there are minor differences in how you are instructed to marshal your response, it will always be directed against the main proposition and not the explanation that has gone before in the first paragraph. This is absolutely key to good BMAT essay writing. Many candidates who've submitted essays for commentary and provided a wonderful unpacking of the proposition in their explanation paragraph then go on to try to demolish the argument there by picking fault with the reasons employed. And this is not what is wanted in your representation of a counterposition. This must be stressed. What we need here is something to the contrary of the proposition or statement, and that thing is an argument and not a rebuttal. The rebuttal seeks to demolish the argument presented before it, but essentially not put an alternative in its place. To score most highly, our counterposition needs to be a different argument, arguing in the opposing direction with regards to the proposition. That is, disagreeing with it with plausible, fresh reasons to support why the disagreement is not only valid, structurally speaking, but persuasive as well. Let's take a trip back to where dolphins being granted the status of non-human persons essay that we looked at in the previous video on how to write an explanation. Our first paragraph within section 3 essays. This was the argument that we used, and it boiled down to an argument from analogy, or more specifically one from similitude, that is, that dolphins and humans are alike in a number of ways, so it's reasonable to say that they are alike in a further key way, that is, ethical status. Now, we might try to demolish this argument by attacking one of the premises here, such as, premise 3, which looks to intelligence and conscious states. We might see this as a necessary condition for ethical status of personhood. However, babies, those suffering from mental illness or in a coma, are also granted such ethical status despite not having these properties, simply because they either will have or once did have such properties. So the holding of such properties as stated in premise 3 is not necessary, and it's doubtful that it's sufficient either. But this would be missing the point entirely, as here we would be attacking our existing argument from the explanation, and as such be providing a rebuttal. And this is a wholly negative endeavour, in that we would be trying to demolish an argument or attack a point of view as being flawed. As such, in rebuttals, we are listening closely to the previous argument or explanation of it and finding fault. Arguments to the contrary, however, are positive, as in they posit an alternative point of view and do not attack the outstanding one. So, at the risk of overstatement, what we're really after is an argument that runs counter to the stated proposition. Back to our dolphins. We know now that we don't want to do a hatchet job on the reasons employed in the explanation, simply because that's not what this rubric wants us to do. It's asking us to argue to the contrary, that dolphins should not be given special ethical status. Anyway, let's start with thinking what domain we want to place our line of reasoning in. The most obvious one is that which we used for our explanation, that of morality and ethics. But, I hear you cry, didn't you say earlier that you had to use a new set of reasons? Well, sure, yeah, we do need to use a new set of reasons, but we can provide them within the same domain of morality. It's going to be difficult, after all, to provide a set of reasons with regards to dolphins within the political or economic realm, and morality just seems to be the obvious choice for our argument on the subject. So, we've chosen our moral domain to situate our reasons within. Now we might look to the concepts of right and wrong that are key within that domain, and point out that for dolphins to be able to persuade a human judge that they understand such concepts would need to exhibit commensurate and appropriate moral behaviour. But dolphins not only don't exhibit such behaviour, furthermore it's unlikely that their environment enables them to exhibit such behaviour. And so dolphins empirically fail the behavioural test of exhibiting an understanding of right and wrong, at least in the eyes of a reasonable human judge. And so, despite falling foul of a potential argument from ignorance, which we'll remain quiet on, if there is no evidence of such understanding of this key moral concept of understanding good and bad, then there's no evidence by which to back up the claim in the proposition. And as we should only do that which we have reason to do in such circumstances, we shouldn't grant dolphins special ethical status on the ground of not having sufficient reason. That doesn't look too bad, although of course there are a number of things we might want to tighten up in our argument, given sufficient time, which there isn't. For when those thoughts are typed up, here's what we would get. Now, for the demands of a second paragraph counter-argument in the BMAT context, this isn't too bad. The blue script shows the key premise that moral reasoning demands evidence of understanding of the moral concepts right and wrong, and the purple shows that we do not have reason to act and change the law. So, just to be sure, we've used the same domain of reasoning here, that is morality, or perhaps more accurately the subject of metaethics, but we've used different reasons within that domain. Here are some other domains that we might consider for our arguments to the contrary. Now, if you'd thought that you really didn't know where to look to create a counterposition, well, it can't be because of limitations on choice. If we argue our explanation paragraph inside an ethical framework of argument, then we're free to choose a legal or economic or whatever as housing reasons to fight against this in our argue to the contrary paragraph that follows. So let's look at another question and pause the presentation here and read the question. What area of reasoning do you think you would use to write your explanation of the proposition? Well, most candidates feel that they can't fall back on a moral argument for the simple reason that destroying a healthy animal doesn't appear to be a moral thing to do. It's possible, of course, that a candidate might appeal to a commercial interest of the vet in servicing his client's needs for commercial gain, but no, most appeal to the idea that the pet is the property of the owner and is there to do with as they wish, and that it's not the vet's concern to intervene between an owner and their property. In other words, a quasi-legal argument, seeing the pet as property. And a legal domain is pretty much where I too would want to place my argument to the contrary. Here you can see my glossed counter that from pets being protected by legislation and owners and relevant others being punishable under criminal law for transgression of that law protecting animals from harm, the vet is advised not to act in a way against such a law in order to save his practice and his best interests. We can fill in the premises here to see the general flow of the argument. Written up, it looks something like this, and you might notice that the final sentence basically rephrases the rubric for emphasis and clarity. So, we can see in this pet example, we've chosen to situate both our explanation and our argument to the contrary within the domain of law. But our explanation appealed to property rights and our argument to the contrary to animal rights and protection from harm. Same domain, different reasons. So, what are our takeaway messages from this? Well, firstly, we need to provide an argument against the proposition. That is, a connected series of statements intended to establish the opposite, and not a focused attack on one premise of our explanation. As such, we need to provide a fresh main reason and a line of reasoning along with it. This line of reasoning should be believable and not set up for us to demolish in our position paragraph to follow. And as in the explanation paragraph for this, we really don't want to know if the argument to the contrary is good or bad, or if you can see any weakness in it. This, as with the explanation, is an analytic task, not an evaluative one. We can evaluate prior reasons in our third and final paragraph, the position paragraph, as a reason why we believe what we believe, and not the explanation or the counter. As stated a number of times previously, try to use a different domain of reasoning if you can, but if you can't, think of an appropriate and plausible alternative one in terms of a fresh set of reasons within the same domain. And there you have it. I hope this short video is useful to your understanding of how to write a plausible and effective quick argument to the contrary within BMAT. Next time we will have a look at the final paragraph for the Section 3 essay, that of the position statement. Thank you for listening.